There is a certain kind of cruelty, the kind that leaves no bruises, no broken glass, no screaming, no single moment you can point to and say, "That was when he broke me." It happens quietly, in paperwork, in bank accounts, in the calm voice of a man who has already decided, "You will not recover." That was Lenora Voss, 58 years old, outside Altoona, Pennsylvania, 28 years given to a marriage that did not end in chaos, but in calculation. A cold morning, a driveway full of boxes, a husband calm enough to sound reasonable while he told her to be careful, because starting over gets expensive when a person has spent too long being taken care of. He said it like a fact, like her future had already been measured, smaller rooms, tighter money, quieter days. A woman her age fading into the kind of life people pass every day without ever really seeing. And for a while, every door she knocked on seemed to prove him right, until she stopped knocking on doors altogether, until one wrong turn led her to a rusting passenger train, abandoned on a dead stretch of private track at the edge of town. Most people would have seen scrap. Lenora saw shelter, and buried inside that broken train was the one hidden thread her husband never thought anyone would find. She did not just survive what he did to her, she turned it into the beginning of his collapse. Subscribe now, because stories like this remind us what quiet strength really looks like, and the women people underestimate often write the most unforgettable second chapter. The morning Lenora Voss left the house did not feel dramatic at first, and that was part of what made it sting. No rainstorm, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a gray sky over the hills outside Altoona, wet gravel dark from the night before, and a line of taped boxes waiting near the front steps of the home where she had spent 28 years making life run smoothly for everyone but herself. From the road, the house still looked steady, respectable, white trim, deep porch, bare maple tree at the end of the drive. It still looked like the kind of place people passed and quietly envied. That was the strange part about endings like this. The outside kept telling one story while the inside had already gone cold. Lenora stood beside the open back door of her SUV with one hand resting on a box marked linens. It was not everything she owned, just what could be called hers without turning the morning into another fight. A cedar chest from her father, a sewing basket, kitchen things she had bought over the years and never stopped keeping track of. A few lamps, winter coats, framed photographs, sheets folded tight and practical, as if neatness could still protect something. The two movers worked in silence, quick, professional, careful not to look at her too long. One of them gave her a small nod while carrying out a lamp from the den, the kind of nod that said he understood enough not to ask questions. Lenora appreciated that more than she wanted to. Little things hit harder than they should have. A scarf still hanging by the mudroom door, the empty corner in the dining room where a cabinet had stood, a dead fern on the porch rail she'd forgotten to bring in before the first frost. 28 years did not vanish all at once. They loosened, they thinned, they came apart in objects first. Gideon stepped out of the house just after 9, with a travel mug in one hand and his phone in the other. He had on the charcoal coat she had bought him one Christmas, back when she still believed warmth, if given long enough, came back. He looked rested. That was what caught her. Not guilty, not angry. Rested. He stopped near the porch steps and glanced toward the SUV. Did they get the lamp from the den? That was how he began, not with kindness, not with apology, just inventory. "It's in the back," Lenora said. He nodded once. "Good." For years she had watched this version of him sharpen. Success had not made Gideon louder, but it had made him smoother. He had become the kind of man who could strip a person bare and still sound measured while doing it. That was part of why people trusted him. He always sounded like the reasonable one in the room. A few minutes later, one of his warehouse managers pulled into the driveway to drop off a folder. He stepped out, saw the boxes, saw Lenora, and gave an awkward half-wave before looking away. Lenora knew that look. It was the look people wore when they had walked into something painful and hoped politeness would carry them through it. She wondered what version of the story had made its way through Gideon's office. Probably the clean version. The one where difficult things happened, but no one was really to blame. Gideon took the folder, thanked the man, and turned back toward her. "You should watch your spending," he said. He did not say it harshly. That almost made it worse. The settlement will go faster than you think, especially now. Lenora felt the words land low in her chest. Not because they were surprising, because they were meant to sound helpful. That was his talent. He could wrap contempt in the language of concern so neatly a stranger might miss the blade entirely. I'm only saying it because reality changes when you're handling it alone, he added. The mover carrying the last box lowered his eyes. The warehouse manager checked his phone. Somewhere across the road, a dog barked once. Then the morning went still again. Lenora said nothing. She set the box into the back seat and closed the door with more care than the moment deserved. For years, she had swallowed small things to keep larger peace. But a tone, a look, a remark dressed up as advice. She had done it at dinner tables, in parking lots, in kitchens after guests went home, in front of people who admired him too much to see what he was doing. Standing there now, she understood something with a clarity so sharp it almost felt like calm. Gideon did not need her to cry. He did not need a scene. He only needed her to leave carrying his version of herself. A woman too old to begin again, too unpracticed to survive alone, too far removed from ordinary struggle to manage real life when it finally reached for her. "Where do you want the garage remote?" she asked. He took a sip of coffee. "Just leave it in the console," like she was returning borrowed property. Lenora reached into her coat pocket and wrapped her fingers around the remote, small, cold, absurdly light. She looked past him at the front windows. Her curtains were still hanging in the breakfast room. The warm fixture above the dining table still glowed. The house already looked less like home than like a place she used to know very well. Then it hit her. Not once that morning had Gideon asked where she was going, not because he forgot, because he assumed the answer would be small. Lenora slid into the driver's seat and shut the door. Her hands looked steady on the wheel. She was grateful for that. The engine turned over on the second try. In the mirror, Gideon stood in the driveway with his coffee, his folder, and that same maddening composure. The posture of a man certain the hardest part was already over because it was happening to someone else. She pulled slowly down the lane, past the bare maple. Nikki passed the stone mailbox with their last names still carved across the front. Past the road she had driven so many times she could have taken it blind. At the end of the drive, she stopped. Not because she did not know which way to turn, because for the first time in her adult life, there was nowhere she could honestly call home. And before the sun went down that same day, she would begin to understand something even worse. Losing the house was only the first cut. What came next was the price of having nowhere to land. By noon, the shape of Lenora's new life had already started to show itself, and it was tighter than she had imagined. She left the driveway with no plan beyond making it through the day without falling apart in public. At first, that felt like enough. She had gas in the tank. She had money in the bank. She had spent most of her adult life solving problems before they turned into disasters. But this was different. The problem now was not a leaking pipe, a missed payment, or a family emergency that could be handled with lists and timing. It was the slow, humiliating realization that starting over at 58 cost more than money. It cost position. It cost ease. It cost the quiet assumption that there would always be somewhere to go at the end of the day. The first rental she called was a furnished one-bedroom over a dentist's office in Hollidaysburg. The woman on the phone sounded pleasant until she asked about income verification. Then her voice changed. Just slightly, enough to let Lenora know she had moved from possible tenant to potential problem. Employment history, security deposit, references. Lenora thanked her, wrote down the address anyway, and sat for a second with the phone in her lap. She had spent years holding a household together so seamlessly that even she had begun to forget none of it counted in rooms like this. The second place was worse in a different way. A low-slung efficiency off Route 22 with a faded sign out front and 2 dead plants by the office door. The man showing it wore a Steelers hoodie and smiled too long. He kept talking about flexibility. How easy they were. How they did not ask too many questions. The room smelled like mildew and old grease. The lock on the window looked loose. He asked if she would be living alone, then asked it again, as if the first answer had not been enough. Lenora did not need to explain why she would not be taking that room. Her body had already decided. By mid-afternoon, she had learned that humiliation came in different price ranges. Some places asked too much money, some asked too many questions, some offered too little safety, some offered nothing but the chance to disappear respectably. That was the part nobody talked about. People liked stories about fresh starts, brave second acts, new beginnings at any age. But real life was less romantic. Real life asked for deposits, pay stubs, recent work history, and the kind of emotional energy that got harder to produce when your whole life had just been boxed up and driven out of a driveway before lunch. She bought a burger and fries from Wendy's and ate in a grocery store parking lot with the engine off. Around her, ordinary life moved in its own careless rhythm. A mother wrestled two toddlers into booster seats. A man in work boots loaded bottled water into the back of a pickup. A teenage girl laughed into her phone while pushing carts toward the store entrance. Nobody looked at Lenora, and that should have made things easier. Instead, it left her with the unnerving feeling that she had stepped just outside the part of life people noticed. She opened the Notes app on her phone and started making a list. Weekly motel rates, deposit estimates, gas, food, medication refill next month. Or insurance. The oil change she had already postponed. The numbers added up faster than her mind wanted to accept. Gideon's voice came back then, not loud, just calm enough to be remembered word for word. Starting over gets expensive. She locked the phone and slipped it back into her purse. There were people she could call. That was true. A cousin in Ohio, a woman from church she had not seen in months, maybe even one of the old neighbors if she was willing to survive the sympathy in their eyes. But every possible rescue came with its own kind of cost. Questions, soft pity, the quiet reshaping of her into someone who needed to be explained. Lenora was not ready for that. Maybe she should have been, but she wasn't. As the light began to thin, she checked into a motel near Duncansville. The room was not filthy, and that almost made it worse. If it had been disgusting, disgust would have been easier to fight. Instead, it was simply tired. Bleached counters, a patterned comforter in colors that had gone out of style years ago, a heater that kicked on with a rattling thud, the kind of room built for passing through, never for landing. Lenora set her purse on the bed and stood there in her coat listening. A television murmured through the wall. Someone laughed too loudly outside. A car door slammed in the parking lot. She should have felt relieved to have a lock and four walls. Instead, a low panic started spreading through her chest, not because the room was terrible, because it was temporary in the most expensive way possible. Money leaving with nothing permanent in return. A few nights here, a week there, another place after that. And her settlement would not vanish in one grand disaster. It would bleed out through modest, reasonable decisions made by a woman trying not to look desperate. She took a hot shower and sat on the edge of the bed in her robe, doing arithmetic on motel stationery with a pen from her purse. Room, gas, food, storage if she needed it, car maintenance, medicine. The math stayed neat. The future did not. Then the front desk called. The weekly rate would be going up on Friday because of a high school tournament coming into town. Lenora thanked the clerk and hung up slowly. That was the moment something inside her shifted. Not grief, not fear. Something colder. She got dressed, picked up her keys, and stepped outside into the evening air. The parking lot smelled like damp asphalt and cigarette smoke. A headlight slid along the highway beyond the motel in a steady stream, everyone moving with the confidence of people who knew where they were headed. Lenora stood there with her coat pulled tight and understood all at once what Gideon had counted on. Not that she would collapse, that she would cooperate, that she would quietly accept smaller and smaller versions of life until she disappeared into one. She got into the SUV and started driving. No destination, no plan worth naming, just a refusal to go back into that room and let a rate sheet decide what the rest of her life would feel like. West first, then south, then farther out, where the roads narrowed and the businesses thinned and the hills turned dark against the sky. She drove past shuttered lots, quiet farm stands, and stretches of land that looked forgotten even in daylight. The motel was still charging her for the night. Her phone map kept rerouting over roads she had never taken, and somewhere past the county line, just as the sky was draining into full evening, she saw something beyond a sagging fence that made her ease her foot off the gas. At first, she thought it was scrap metal. Then, she saw the windows. The road had gone quiet by then, the kind of quiet that made every sound inside the car feel too loud. Lenora eased off the gas and looked again through the windshield. At first, all she saw was a long shape beyond a sagging fence, rust-colored metal half hidden by weeds. Then, the outline sharpened. Windows, curved roofline. A passenger train sitting still on dead private track at the edge of what looked like an abandoned excursion property. She should have kept driving. Instead, she pulled onto the shoulder and sat there with both hands on the wheel, staring at it through the fading light. The place looked forgotten in the truest sense of the word. Not maintained, not protected, not even worth stealing from. A broken warning sign leaned sideways near the fence. Two low buildings sat farther back in shadow, their windows black. The gravel lot had been swallowed by grass. Still, the train itself held its shape. That was what caught her. Even from the road, Lenora could tell it had not collapsed. It was worn down, yes, stripped by weather, but the frame looked true. The body still carried a kind of elegance under the damage. Most people would have seen scrap and kept moving. Lenora kept looking. She killed the engine. Cold air rushed in when she opened the door. It smelled like wet leaves, iron, and old ground gone undisturbed too long. Somewhere far off, a truck moved down the highway. Closer in, nothing. No voices, no lights, no sound, except the wind brushing through weeds tall enough to lean against the fence. Lenora walked toward the loose section of chain link where one post had pulled free and stood there peering in. The train sat 30 yards ahead, still and heavy in the darkening air. One window near the back was cracked. The paint had long since faded to a tired, weather-beaten shell, but the steps at one end were still attached and the line of the carriage still looked strong. She told herself she was only going closer, nothing more. The weeds brushed against her jeans as she stepped through the opening and crossed the lot. Up close, the carriage looked rougher, but somehow more possible. Rust had crept along the seams. One panel had buckled slightly. The old lettering along the side had almost disappeared. But the undercarriage held. The body sat level. Even the handrail at the entry was still firm beneath her fingers. Lenora climbed halfway up the steps and shined her phone flashlight through the glass. Dark inside, but not destroyed. She could make out rows of seats, luggage racks, wood trim beneath the windows. Dust lay thick over everything, and the beam caught a dull drift of it hanging in the air. The place looked exhausted, not ruined. She tried the main handle. Locked, of course. She almost laughed at herself then. What was she doing? Standing on private property in the dark, trying the door of an abandoned train like a woman with no sense left at all. She should go back to the motel, take the loss, sleep in the overpriced room, start over again in the morning. Then she noticed the side service door farther down. It hung slightly crooked. Not open, just not fully sealed. Lenora stepped back down and moved along the carriage. Her heart had picked up, not from panic exactly, but from the simple fact that this was the first thing all day that had not asked her for proof. No application, no deposit, no employment history, just a rusted door standing slightly ajar in a forgotten place. She pulled. At first, it held. Then it gave with a low scraping groan that sounded louder than it should have in all that empty quiet. The smell hit her first. Dust, dry wood, metal, old fabric, not mildew, not rot, not the swampy smell she had expected. She raised the flashlight and stepped inside. The beam traveled slowly over worn passenger seats, narrow aisles, dented wall fixtures, overhead racks, and scuffed wood trim. Dirt and leaves had gathered in the corners. Broken glass glittered beneath one cracked window. A panel near the rear had come loose from the wall, but the floor felt solid under her feet. The roof had held, and the air was stale but dry. And just like that, something inside her shifted. Not hope. Recognition. Years ago, before marriage had narrowed her life into errands, hosting, schedules, and maintenance, Lenora had worked around old properties and salvage interiors. She knew the difference between decay that only looked final and decay that really was. This train had been left behind, but it was not gone. Beneath the dust and neglect, it still had bones. She moved deeper inside. Near the back, one wider seating section framed a small table bolted between facing benches. The window there was dirty but unbroken. The overhead fixture hung crooked but intact. If the floor were swept, if the glass were cleaned, if the cold draft at the frame were sealed, Lenora stopped herself. This was ridiculous. She had nowhere stable to sleep tonight and was standing in an abandoned rail car imagining how the light might look if the window were washed. She should leave, go back to the motel, take the room, wake up and keep pretending there was a sensible version of this day. But the thought landed flat. Her flashlight drifted back to the benches, then to the strip of floor between them. It was not comfort, it was not safety, it was not a plan, but for the first time all day, it looked like a choice. Lenora stood there in the stillness, listening to the dead quiet inside the carriage and the faint movement of wind outside. Then she understood the real question was no longer whether this place made sense. It was whether she was desperate enough to spend one night inside it. Lenora did not decide in one bold cinematic moment to move into the train. That would have made the choice sound braver than it was. What she did was smaller and more believable. She told herself she only needed one night, just one. One night without another motel charge. One night without a front desk clerk glancing from her driver's license to the boxes in the back of her SUV. One night to sit somewhere nobody expected anything from her. So she went back to the car and carried in only what she could justify. 2 blankets, a pillow, bottled water, her phone charger, a grocery bag with crackers, almonds, and the last of the fries she had not eaten earlier. It was not a plan. It was barely even a decision. It was what happened when exhaustion outran pride. Inside the carriage, the air felt still, dry, close. Not warm, but shielded. She cleared the rear seating section a little at a time. Leaves first. Then broken glass. Then dust brushed aside with an old folded brochure she found under one of the benches. The work steadied her. Clear one patch, set down the water, fold the blanket, put the purse within reach. Small acts of order in a day that had offered none. When she finally sat, the silence pressed in around her. No television through the wall, no footsteps in a hallway, no clerk at a desk. Only the tiny sounds of the carriage cooling for the night, a soft metal tick. Wind brushing the weeds outside, one loose strip of trim tapping faintly somewhere farther up the aisle. She should have felt frightened. Instead, she felt relief. Nobody could see her here. That truth came softly, but it landed deep. No one was measuring how gracefully she was failing. No one was asking what happened. No one was waiting for her to explain herself. The train was cold. The train was ugly. The train was probably a terrible idea, but for the first time all day, it was hers in the only way that mattered that night. It asked nothing from her. She slept badly, but honestly. Rain touched the roof once in the early hours. Her neck hurt when she woke. The bench was harder than it had seemed in the dark. But when dawn pushed a weak silver light through the dirty windows, shame did not arrive the way she expected. A practical thought did. If she cleaned the glass by the table, more light would come in. Lenora sat there for a long moment, almost irritated with herself. That should not have been her first thought after waking in an abandoned train, but the instinct came anyway. See what is wrong. Quiet it down. Make it work. Outside, the property looked even more tired in daylight. Broken asphalt, grass through gravel, smaller service buildings sagging at the edges, no fresh tire marks, no workers, no real sign that anyone had touched the place in a long time. It did not feel watched. It felt postponed. She drove into town for coffee, a restroom, and 10 minutes under bright lights. The numbers still looked bad. Motels, deposits, gas, food. But now another truth sat beside them. The train had felt more honest than any room she had paid for. Not safer, not smarter, just more honest. By late morning, she was in a discount store buying cleaning gloves, trash bags, paper towels, bottled water, and a plastic storage bin. On the drive back, she kept waiting for the full absurdity of what she was doing to stop her. It never did. In daylight, the carriage was impossible to romanticize. Rust, peeling paint, clouded windows, dead track. The kind of place people would pity from the road and never approach. Lenora parked anyway. This time, when she stepped inside, she did not enter like someone hiding. She entered like someone taking stock. She tied her hair back, pulled on the gloves, set the bin down in the aisle. The carriage was still stale, still damaged, still full of work. But now she could see what had shifted. It was not hope, it was control. She bent to clear the first handful of leaves from the floor and saw something wedged deep beneath the far bench, not trash, not broken trim, something flat, dark, leather-bound. Lenora slowly straightened, then reached for the flashlight. The leather-bound book was heavier than it looked. Lenora crouched in the aisle, pulled it free from beneath the bench, and brushed the dust from the cover with the side of her hand. The leather had cracked at the corners. A small brass clasp still held. For a second, she just looked at it in the beam of the flashlight, listening to the stillness inside the carriage. Then she opened it. It was a maintenance ledger, dates, repair notes, supply orders, short entries written in neat block letters by hands long gone. A lamp replaced near the rear section, loose trim tightened above the west windows, upholstery patched before spring excursions, brass polished before reopening. Lenora read that one twice. Not because it changed anything practical, but because it changed the way she saw the train. This place had not started as wreckage. People had once cared for it, swept it, repaired it, prepared it for passengers. Families must have sat in these seats. Children must have pressed their hands to these windows. Someone had once opened these doors expecting life to move through them. That mattered, because being left behind was not the same as being worthless. She sat on the rear bench with the ledger open on her lap and let the flashlight drift slowly across the carriage. The old luggage rack still ran straight overhead. The brass coat hooks were tarnished but intact. The wood trim beneath the windows looked dark and tired under the grime, but real. Nothing in the space had been careless. Even now, under the dust and neglect, the carriage still held intention. Lenora knew that feeling. By the end of the afternoon, she had filled half the plastic storage bin with leaves, broken glass, old paper, and scraps of damaged paneling. She worked in a steady rhythm, sweep, sort, wipe, clear, not fast, but with purpose. And as she worked, something old began returning to her. Not courage, skill. There had been a time when she could walk into a worn-out room and know what it needed before anyone else noticed the problem. More light here, better balance there. Keep that, remove this, save the original detail if you can. For years she had used that instinct in small domestic ways, and then buried it under marriage, schedules, errands, and the long maintenance of someone else's comfort. Now it was back. The cracked rear window needed a temporary cover. The bench frames might be salvageable. The overhead fixture looked dead, but the glass shade was still good. The aisle did not need changing. It needed clearing. The train was not beautiful yet, but it was beginning to answer her. That realization stopped her for a moment. She stood in the aisle with a dustcloth in one hand and looked at the cleaned strip of wood beneath the rear window. Under the grime, the finish had warmed into a rich honey brown. One brass hook near the seat caught the light and gave it back. A narrow section of floor no longer looked abandoned. It looked claimed. And just like that, the truth settled into her. This was no longer only where she had ended up. It was becoming something she was making. That thought carried weight. Because once the train began to reflect her taste, her judgment, her patience, it stopped being a hiding place and became evidence. Evidence of what she could still do. Now evidence of the woman she had once been before life narrowed around her. Lenora sat again, this time not from exhaustion, but to study. The rear table could be scrubbed clean. The seat cushions were too far gone, but the frames beneath them might hold. The curtain rods were still fixed in place. The narrow wall panel beside the cracked window had started to bow slightly outward. Her eyes went back to that panel. She had noticed it earlier, but now, with more of the dust gone and the light angled differently, it stood out. Not broken exactly, just not sitting flush, as if something behind it had pushed over time, or as if someone years ago had closed it carelessly and never returned. Lenora rose and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the seam. It shifted. Not much, just enough. She narrowed her eyes and crouched lower. The gap was thin, but real. She angled the flashlight along the edge. At first, she saw only shadow. Then something flat caught the light deep behind the panel. Paper, maybe, or a packet. Something tucked where no one casually cleaning would ever think to look. The maintenance ledger lay open on the bench behind her. One of the earlier entries came back to her then. Draft near west wall. Recheck after season close. She stayed still for a second. Most of the day, the train had felt like a mirror, showing her what still lived in her beneath the dust of other people's needs. Now, for the first time, it felt like it might be hiding something too. Lenora reached into the cleaning bin, found the small screwdriver she had brought for loose fixtures, and slipped the tip gently into the seam. The panel resisted, then gave a little. A colder thread of air touched her hand. She worked the screwdriver deeper, careful not to crack the wood. This time, the warped edge lifted enough for a folded corner to slide forward from the darkness behind it. Old paper, heavy stock, yellowed with age. Lenora set the flashlight on the bench to free both hands and slowly reached for it. The paper was stiff with age and colder than the wood around it. Lenora eased it free from the wall cavity and unfolded it on the rear table. It was not a letter, not a confession, just an old maintenance transfer sheet from the final years of the excursion line. Carriage number, service notes, inventory marks, dry administrative language that should have meant nothing. But one line caught her eye. Records packet retained pending property review. Lenora read it again, then looked back into the gap behind the wall panel. The folded sheet had not been alone. Something else sat deeper inside the cavity, wider, flatter, caught behind a stud where no one cleaning casually would have reached. She slid her fingers in, worked it loose, and pulled out a thin bundle tied once with faded cotton string. Inside were brittle documents, with title references, parcel sketches, survey notations, and a typed letter on old company stationery referring to delayed sale activity after the excursion company shut down. Most people would have seen junk. Lenora saw a paper trail. At first, none of it looked dramatic, just dead property records and bureaucratic leftovers. Then she found a small service map of the spur where the train still sat. The dead track was marked clearly, along with a narrow strip of adjoining service land and a short access road leading to the county route. Beside it was a notation: transfer unresolved pending holding assignment. Lenora frowned. That language felt familiar in the wrong way, not because she understood it fully, but because she had spent enough years around Gideon's business life to know how simple things got buried under polished wording. Fee, assignment, holding, transfer unresolved. Those were not ordinary human words. Those were company words, lawyer words, the kind of language used when land or liability had been moved into places most people would never think to follow. She kept reading. A later page listed parcel numbers and referenced a holding company name she did not know. Still, the shape of it bothered her. It sounded like the kind of neat, forgettable company name Gideon's attorneys used when they wanted something kept quiet and tidy. Lenora sat very still. This was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to stir the one instinct she no longer ignored. When boring paperwork starts to feel familiar, there is usually a reason. Outside, the afternoon had already begun to dim through the dirty windows. She gathered the papers, slid them into the plastic bin beneath the cleaning cloths, and forced herself to finish clearing the rear section. But the work no longer held her attention the way it had earlier. Her mind kept circling back to the same phrases. Records packet retained. Property review. Holding assignment. By evening, she'd made up her mind. The next morning, she would go to the county records office, not because she believed she had uncovered anything explosive, because she needed to know why an abandoned train and a dead strip of rail land suddenly felt connected to a life she had just been shoved out of. She slept lighter that night. The train no longer felt like only a hidden refuge. It felt linked to something unfinished, something postponed and buried in paperwork people assumed no one would ever bother reading. At the county records office the next day, the clerk at the front desk wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and spoke with the practiced patience of someone who had spent years helping confused people ask incomplete questions. Lenora gave her the parcel numbers she had copied down and asked for archived records tied to the excursion property and adjoining service strip. It took time. Older files, tax map binders, archived parcel transfers, a clerk disappearing into the back and returning with more than Lenora expected. She sat under fluorescent lights at a public table and started reading. The first stack gave her very little. Sale delays, bankruptcy references, tax status changes, dead operating names. The usual fog of paper that made simple things look impossible to follow. Then the service strip appeared again. The same narrow section marked on the old spur map from the train. It had not transferred cleanly with the rest of the excursion property. It had been reassigned later, then reassigned again, this time to a holding company. Lenora stared at the name. She knew it. Not because Gideon had ever explained it to her, because years earlier she had seen it in small print on a folder left open in his study, one of several quiet entities his lawyers had set up to keep things clean. At the time, the name had meant nothing. Now, under the flat light of the records office, it meant enough to change the rhythm of her breathing. She copied the page, then another, then a third referencing access use tied to neighboring logistics activity in more recent years. By the time she left the office, the envelope in her bag no longer felt like dead paper. It felt like the beginning of a question large enough to matter. Back in the train that evening, Lenora spread the copies across the rear table beside the old packet. The train, the dead spur, the service strip, the holding company, Gideon. The connection was still thin, too thin to accuse, too real to dismiss. Then her eye caught one line on the newest county copy. A notation she had missed at the records office, related access income reported separately. Lenora read it once, then again, slower. And in the quiet of the carriage, with the last light draining from the windows, she understood something cold and clear. Whatever Gideon had hidden, it might not have been just land. The words sat on the page longer than they should have. Related access income reported separately. Lenora read the line again under the weak glow of the flashlight, then once more in the dimming natural light from the windows, as if different light might change what it meant. It didn't. The phrase was still dry. Administrative, easy to miss if a person was skimming for something louder, but that was exactly why it unsettled her. Quiet language had done a great deal of damage in her life already. Quiet language in bank folders, quiet language in settlement papers, quiet language in the calm voice of a man who had known how to bury consequence inside words that sounded harmless. She set the paper down very carefully. The train was silent around her. Dust still lingered in the corners she had not yet reached. The cracked rear window held its temporary plastic covering with a faint inward bow. A cleaned strip of wood beneath it caught the last of the evening light. The place looked halfway between ruin and intention, and for the first time since she had stepped inside it, Lenora felt something sharper than survival. She felt alert, not because she knew exactly what she had found, because she knew she could no longer afford to treat it like coincidence. That night, she did not clean. She organized. She cleared the rear table fully, laid out the old records packet, the county copies, and the maintenance transfer sheet, then began making columns on the back of a grocery receipt, parcel numbers, dates, company names, transfer references. She wrote slowly, crossing nothing out. The habit came back the way old muscle memory does. Years of holding a household together had trained her to manage chaos quietly, to turn scraps into order, to spot the one missing receipt, the one date that did not match, the one detail everyone else assumed would take care of itself. By 10 o'clock, she had a rough chain. The excursion company failed. The service strip did not transfer cleanly. It passed later to a holding company. That holding company connected somehow to Gideon's world, and the service strip had been producing access income reported separately from whatever larger property arrangements existed around it. Separately. That word mattered too. Lenora sat back and rubbed both hands over her face. The first dangerous thing about paperwork was how quickly it could make a person feel smarter than they were. She did not want that. She did not want to build a whole future out of fragments just because she needed something to be true. If she was going to move another inch with this, she needed someone who understood the language on those pages without having to guess. The next morning, she drove into town and parked outside a small office above a tax prep storefront in Altoona. The sign beside the stairwell listed 2 names under forensic accounting and asset review. She had found them the night before, using the library Wi-Fi and her phone under a blanket, searching phrases she had never imagined needing: concealed income divorce, holding company asset tracing, undeclared access revenue. She almost drove away twice, not because she was unsure of the place, because walking into an office like that meant admitting this might be real. Upstairs, the receptionist wore a navy sweater and a look that suggested she had heard every kind of half-explained mess a person could carry in a folder. Lenora did not give her the whole story. Just enough. Recent divorce, some property records, possible connection to undisclosed income. Could someone tell her whether she was misunderstanding what she had found? 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from a man in his 60s with silver hair, rimless glasses, and the kind of patient expression that made it difficult to dramatize in front of him. His name was Neil Harrow. He did not interrupt. He did not fill silence too quickly. He simply looked over the papers one by one, occasionally making a small mark on a yellow pad with a mechanical pencil. Lenora watched his face for a reaction and got almost none. That worried her more than surprise would have. When he finally spoke, his tone stayed level. "This by itself is not enough to prove fraud," he said. The sentence landed clean and hard. Lenora nodded once. "I understand. But," he added, sliding one of the county copies slightly forward with the tip of his pencil, "it is enough to justify asking better questions than anyone apparently asked during your divorce." She felt something move in her chest. Not relief exactly, but footing. He tapped the notation about access income. If this holding company was connected to your former husband, and if it was receiving ongoing revenue from this service strip, and if that income-producing interest was not disclosed during asset review. He looked up at her then. That becomes more than a clerical curiosity. Lenora kept her face still. "How much more?" "That depends on what the records show once someone starts tracing the entity properly. Could be minor. Could be significant. But I'll tell you this." He lifted the old map page and set it down again. "People do not usually keep side income arrangements in dormant entities because they enjoy neat paperwork." That was the first moment she let herself feel it, not triumph. Heat. A low, steady heat that started somewhere beneath the fear and did not feel like panic at all. Neil gave her the name of a divorce attorney in Johnstown who had handled post-settlement disclosure disputes before. "If I were you," he said, "I would stop talking about this casually to anyone, and I would make copies of everything. There's multiple copies." "I haven't told anyone." "Good." He gathered the papers into a cleaner stack than she had handed him and slid them back across the desk. "One more thing," he said. "Do not assume the value is just the land. These arrangements often make more sense once you look at what they were used to support." Lenora frowned. "Support what?" He shrugged lightly. "Access, storage, transport, routing, side agreements. Depends who benefited and how long it ran." The words stayed with her all the way down the stairs. The value is not just the land. Back in the SUV, she did not start the engine right away. Cars moved below on the street. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone was unloading boxes with the hollow thump of cardboard hitting concrete. The day looked ordinary. Too ordinary for what had just shifted. Gideon had not simply left her with less. He may have left her with less while still holding back something that should have counted. That distinction changed the emotional balance of the entire divorce. By late afternoon, Lenora was in the library making copies. One set in her tote bag, one in the storage bin back at the train, one sealed in a manila envelope she planned to leave in the cedar chest beneath folded sheets. She wrote down names, dates, and the accountant's exact phrasing while it was still fresh. No more drifting. No more reacting. No more waiting for the next expense to corner her. For the first time since the day in the driveway, silence meant something different. It was no longer the silence of a woman shrinking. It was the silence of someone assembling. That evening, back in the train, or she spread the copies out again across the rear table. The carriage felt changed now, not because the walls were cleaner or the rear section brighter, but because it had become more than shelter, more than a private place to disappear. It had become the place where Gideon's certainty had finally started to crack. Lenora sat with that thought for a long time. Then she reached for the county copy again, the one referencing access income, and this time, farther down in the margin, she noticed a smaller note Neil had underlined lightly in pencil before handing it back. See related use permit file. Lenora looked at the line, then slowly lifted her eyes toward the dark windows of the train. If there was a use permit file, then there were more records. And maybe, for the first time, a direct path to what Gideon thought no one would ever follow. The words sat on the page longer than they should have. Related access income reported separately. Lenora read the line again under the weak glow of the flashlight, then once more in the dimming natural light from the windows, as if different light might change what it meant. It didn't. The phrase was still dry. Administrative, easy to miss if a person was skimming for something louder, but that was exactly why it unsettled her. Quiet language had done a great deal of damage in her life already. Quiet language in bank folders, quiet language in settlement papers, quiet language in the calm voice of a man who had known how to bury consequence inside words that sounded harmless. She set the paper down very carefully. The train was silent around her. Dust still lingered in the corners she had not yet reached. The cracked rear window held its temporary plastic covering with a faint inward bow. A cleaned strip of wood beneath it caught the last of the evening light. The place looked halfway between ruin and intention, and for the first time since she had stepped inside it, Lenora felt something sharper than survival. She felt alert, not because she knew exactly what she had found, because she knew she could no longer afford to treat it like coincidence. That night, she did not clean. She organized. She cleared the rear table fully, laid out the old records packet, the county copies, and the maintenance transfer sheet, then began making columns on the back of a grocery receipt, parcel numbers, dates, company names, transfer references. She wrote slowly, crossing nothing out. The habit came back the way old muscle memory does. Years of holding a household together had trained her to manage chaos quietly, to turn scraps into order, to spot the one missing receipt, the one date that did not match, the one detail everyone else assumed would take care of itself. By 10 o'clock, she had a rough chain. The excursion company failed. The service strip did not transfer cleanly. It passed later to a holding company. That holding company connected somehow to Gideon's world, and the service strip had been producing access income reported separately from whatever larger property arrangements existed around it. Separately. That word mattered too. Lenora sat back and rubbed both hands over her face. The first dangerous thing about paperwork was how quickly it could make a person feel smarter than they were. She did not want that. She did not want to build a whole future out of fragments just because she needed something to be true. If she was going to move another inch with this, she needed someone who understood the language on those pages without having to guess. The next morning, she drove into town and parked outside a small office above a tax prep storefront in Altoona. The sign beside the stairwell listed 2 names under forensic accounting and asset review. She had found them the night before, using the library Wi-Fi and her phone under a blanket, searching phrases she had never imagined needing: concealed income divorce, holding company asset tracing, undeclared access revenue. She almost drove away twice. Not because she was unsure of the place, because walking into an office like that meant admitting this might be real. Upstairs, the receptionist wore a navy sweater and a look that suggested she had heard every kind of half-explained mess a person could carry in a folder. Lenora did not give her the whole story. Just enough. Recent divorce, some property records, possible connection to undisclosed income. Could someone tell her whether she was misunderstanding what she had found? 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from a man in his 60s with silver hair, rimless glasses, and the kind of patient expression that made it difficult to dramatize in front of him. His name was Neil Harrow. He did not interrupt. He did not fill silence too quickly. He simply looked over the papers one by one, occasionally making a small mark on a yellow pad with a mechanical pencil. Lenora watched his face for a reaction and got almost none. That worried her more than surprise would have. When he finally spoke, his tone stayed level. "This by itself is not enough to prove fraud," he said. The sentence landed clean and hard. Lenora nodded once. "I understand. But," he added, sliding one of the county copies slightly forward with the tip of his pencil, "it is enough to justify asking better questions than anyone apparently asked during your divorce." She felt something move in her chest. Not relief exactly, but footing. He tapped the notation about access income. If this holding company was connected to your former husband, and if it was receiving ongoing revenue from this service strip, and if that income-producing interest was not disclosed during asset review. He looked up at her then. That becomes more than a clerical curiosity. Lenora kept her face still. "How much more?" "That depends on what the records show once someone starts tracing the entity properly. Could be minor, could be significant. But I'll tell you this." He lifted the old map page and set it down again. People do not usually keep side income arrangements in dormant entities because they enjoy neat paperwork. That was the first moment she let herself feel it, not triumph. Heat. A low, steady heat that started somewhere beneath the fear and did not feel like panic at all. Neil gave her the name of a divorce attorney in Johnstown who had handled post-settlement disclosure disputes before. "If I were you," he said, "I would stop talking about this casually to anyone, and I would make copies of everything. There's multiple copies." "I haven't told anyone." "Good." He gathered the papers into a cleaner stack than she had handed him and slid them back across the desk. "One more thing," he said. "Do not assume the value is just the land. These arrangements often make more sense once you look at what they were used to support." Lenora frowned. "Support what?" He shrugged lightly. "Access, storage, transport, routing, side agreements. Depends who benefited and how long it ran." The words stayed with her all the way down the stairs. The value is not just the land. Back in the SUV, she did not start the engine right away. Cars moved below on the street. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone was unloading boxes with the hollow thump of cardboard hitting concrete. The day looked ordinary. Too ordinary for what had just shifted. Gideon had not simply left her with less. He may have left her with less while still holding back something that should have counted. That distinction changed the emotional balance of the entire divorce. By late afternoon, Lenora was in the library making copies. One set in her tote bag, one in the storage bin back at the train, one sealed in a manila envelope she planned to leave in the cedar chest beneath folded sheets. She wrote down names, dates, and the accountant's exact phrasing while it was still fresh. No more drifting. No more reacting. No more waiting for the next expense to corner her. For the first time since the day in the driveway, silence meant something different. It was no longer the silence of a woman shrinking. It was the silence of someone assembling. That evening, back in the train, where she spread the copies out again across the rear table. The carriage felt changed now, not because the walls were cleaner or the rear section brighter, but because it had become more than shelter, more than a private place to disappear. It had become the place where Gideon's certainty had finally started to crack. Lenora sat with that thought for a long time. Then she reached for the county copy again, the one referencing access income, and this time, farther down in the margin, she noticed a smaller note Neil had underlined lightly in pencil before handing it back. See related use permit file. Lenora looked at the line, then slowly lifted her eyes toward the dark windows of the train. If there was a use permit file, then there were more records. And maybe, for the first time, a direct path to what Gideon thought no one would ever follow. The comment sat under the photograph like a hand on a locked door. Where exactly is this? Lenora knew the name attached to it, not well, not personally, but well enough to feel the shift in her stomach. The account belonged to someone from Gideon's office, one of those quiet employees who moved files, answered calls, and saw more than people assumed. It was not proof of anything by itself. It was worse than proof. It was proximity. She did not answer. She turned the phone over on the table and listened to the train settle around her. Outside, wind moved through the weeds along the dead spur with a dry, brushing sound. Inside, the carriage held its narrow band of lamplight and newly cleaned wood, warm enough now to feel inhabited, exposed enough now to feel newly precious. That was the risk she had not fully measured. The train was no longer invisible. The very beauty she had pulled back out of it had begun attracting eyes, and eyes, in the wrong direction, could lead him straight to her. The next morning, Lenora took the preservation post down, not out of fear, out of timing. The photos had already done their work. People had seen enough to react, enough to admire, enough, apparently, for one thread of Gideon's world to tug loose. She saved screenshots of the comments, shut the page down, and drove to Neil Harrow's office with the phone in her purse and the county copies in a folder on the passenger seat. Neil read the screenshot once and set the phone back on the desk. "That doesn't mean he knows where you are," he said. "No," Lenora answered. But it means someone around him is asking." "Yes." That one word carried the rest of the thought without needing to say it. The space she had been working inside, quietly, carefully, was beginning to narrow. Neil slid his yellow pad closer and wrote down a name: Elise Marr, divorce litigation, post-settlement disclosure, Johnstown. "If there's any movement at all on his side," he said, tearing off the page, "you stop treating this like a private concern and start treating it like a legal one." Lenora took the paper. "You think the records are enough?" "I think they're enough to make him uncomfortable. Sometimes that tells you more than the records do." That line stayed with her all the way to Johnstown. Elise Marr's office sat on the second floor of a brick building above a title company and across from a bank that had likely seen more quiet collapses than anyone inside it would ever admit. Elise herself was not warm in an obvious way. She was precise, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, the sort of woman who did not waste sympathy when clarity would be more useful. She went through the documents in silence, not rushing, not lingering, just building order. Lenora watched her hand sort the pages into piles: excursion records, county copies, holding company references, access income notation, use permit file. No dramatic reaction came, no sudden lift of the head. Somehow that made the room feel more serious. Finally, Elise set down the last sheet. Did your former husband disclose this holding company during settlement review?" "No." "Did anyone on your side ask specifically about related entities, service access interests, or ancillary revenue?" "I don't know." Elise nodded once. "Then that becomes my question." "Not a question. My question." Lenora felt that land somewhere deeper than relief. Elise tapped the notation about separate access income. "This is not a victory, not yet, but it is enough to justify formal inquiry. If he left out an income-producing interest tied to a controlled entity, especially during active divorce review, he may have a problem." "May have? I don't promise outcomes before I see the full trail." That answer, oddly enough, strengthened Lenora more than reassurance would have. There was no performance here, no borrowed confidence, just movement. Real movement. Elise leaned back in her chair and met Lenora's eyes fully for the first time. "If we proceed, he'll know soon enough that someone is looking in the right place." Lenora heard the sentence exactly as it was meant. The quiet phase was ending. By the time she drove back toward the train, the sky had lowered into one of those dull western Pennsylvania afternoons that made every parking lot, roadside sign, and stand of bare trees look briefly abandoned. Her phone stayed silent the whole way. That silence had weight now. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like the pause before something arrived. At the property, nothing had changed on the surface. Same broken fence, same dead track, same weather-beaten side buildings leaning into neglect. But as soon as Lenora stepped inside the carriage, she felt it. The place had shifted because she had shifted. This was no longer just where she had landed. It was where she had started to turn and face him back. She set the folder on the rear table, removed her coat, and forced herself into ordinary tasks. Wipe the kettle, fold the blanket, sweep the narrow strip by the bench. The small motions helped. They kept her from staring at the phone. They kept her from waiting like a woman bracing for a storm. The vibration on the table came anyway. One message, no name needed. She knew the number before she picked it up. "Gideon." Only 5 words this time. "Call me. Now, Lenora." She looked at the message without blinking. Not, "How are you?" Not, "Where have you been?" Not even the polished concern he used when other people were watching. Just command. Just urgency. For the first time since the day she left the house, He sounded like a man who had discovered something he could not smoothly explain away. Lenora set the phone down beside Elise Marr's card and did not touch it again. Outside, the weeds scraped softly against the side of the carriage. Inside, the lamp cast a tight ring of light over the records on the table and the message glowing cold on the screen. Tomorrow, Gideon would no longer be guessing whether she had found something. Tomorrow, he would know she had. Gideon called 3 more times that night. Lenora let the phone light up, then fade, then fall silent again on the rear table beside the attorney's card and the copied records. Each missed call told her more than a conversation would have, not because she enjoyed ignoring him, because Gideon had never been a man who reached twice unless something had shifted under his feet. By morning, Elise Marr had already sent a formal notice requesting supplemental disclosure tied to the holding company, the service strip, and any access-related income connected to the dead spur. It was not a dramatic move, no courtroom scene, no officers at the door, just a letter written in the kind of language men like Gideon respected most when it arrived from the right office and bore the right signature. That was enough. He responded faster than he should have, too fast for a man with nothing to hide. Within days, the old balance between them began to change. For the first time since the divorce, Lenora was no longer standing outside his version of the story, trying to prove she had been wronged. Gideon was the one now being asked to explain. The holding company, the undeclared access income, the service arrangement tied to neighboring logistics use. The questions did not accuse loudly. They did something more dangerous. They stayed calm and kept going. That was what cracked him, not one big revelation. Pressure, paper, dates, signatures, the wrong omission in the wrong file once someone started pulling the thread. Lenora never went back to the house. She never met him in a parking lot. She never gave him the confrontation he might have been prepared for. She let the records speak in rooms built for that purpose. That choice mattered, because Gideon had spent years assuming she would either stay quiet forever or get emotional too soon. What he had not prepared for was patience. The settlement review was reopened, then widened again. What first looked like a small undisclosed interest turned out to be part of a longer pattern of keeping side value in places unlikely to be noticed unless someone knew exactly where to look. Not enough to destroy him in one blow. Real life is usually slower than that, but enough to expose what mattered most. He had not played fair when fairness still counted. He had left her with less while keeping more than he declared. That truth changed everything. Lenora's correction did not come as fantasy money falling from the sky. It came the way real reversals often do, in stages: revised disclosure, negotiation pressure, the threat of court, a settlement amendment he accepted only after his confidence had begun to fray. By the time it was done, she had recovered more than the driveway version of her future had ever allowed her to imagine. Not only money, leverage, space, time, the right to begin again without apologizing for the cost. And through all of it, the train remained, not as a hiding place anymore, as witness. By late fall, the rear carriage had become undeniably beautiful. The wood trim glowed warm in the lamplight. The bench frames had been rebuilt and fitted with simple custom cushions. The cracked window had been properly replaced. The table where she once spread brittle county records now held a ceramic mug, a folded throw, and a small vase with dried stems from the edge of the property. The train no longer looked like something waiting to be discarded. It looked chosen. That was the part Lenora loved most. Not that she had saved it, that she had understood it before anyone else did. On the first cold evening she spent there after the amended settlement cleared, she sat alone in the rear section with a blanket over her knees and listened to the wind moving past the carriage walls. No motel heater kicking on, no hallway noise, no rate sheet, no one asking for proof she belonged, just the quiet of a place made human again by care. She thought then about the woman who had pulled off the road months earlier, because something beyond a broken fence had made her ease her foot off the gas. That woman had not come looking for a comeback story. She had come looking for one night she could afford. One night out of sight, one night with a door between herself and the life that had just closed behind her. What she found instead was herself. Not the version Gideon had measured, not the version the divorce paperwork had reduced, not the version waiting nervously in rental offices, the real one. The woman who could still see bones beneath damage, the woman who could still build, the woman who had not been emptied, only buried. That was the final truth of it. He thought he had left her with nothing. What he actually left her with, once the fear burned off, was the clear, hard ground from which she could finally start choosing for herself. If you felt Lenora's comeback, like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what hurt more, losing the house or hearing the man she gave her life to speak as if she was already nothing?